History's strange, it's alien, and it won't give us what we would like to have.
Dave Does History Today on Bill Mick Live. Follow us on Facebook on the WMMB page. Our headline today, Brainless Body Farms. That's what we talked in Hour 2. Hour 3 is always Dave Does History, and we're following up on what happened with the founders after the Declaration was signed. Dave, where are we going today?
When we think about the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, we tend to imagine them as a bunch of middle-aged lawyers sitting around Philadelphia arguing over stuff. And, of course, a man born this day in 1746 by the name of Thomas Heyward Jr. was certainly a lawyer. But that kind of misses the image of who this guy really turned out to be. If we were ever to decide to make a big blockbuster film about one of the signers, an action film about one of the signers, and get Christopher Nolan to direct it, Thomas Heyward would be one of the first people we would want to tell the story of. This man has absolutely everything, and he was willing to put every bit of it on the line. As I said, he was born this day, July 28, 1746, in South Carolina. His dad, Daniel Heyward, wasn't just wealthy, Bill. He was one of the richest men in North America. He was known as the greatest planter in his province, and that was not an exaggeration. The Heyward family would control as much as 17,000 acres of land in South Carolina during Daniel's lifetime. And over the next generation into Thomas's lifetime, they would grow to 26,000 acres. And, of course, South Carolina, they were one of the largest slaveholding families in America. Now think about that for just a moment. This guy, Thomas Heyward Jr., is not made to be someone who is fighting to improve his station in life. He already has it made. He was the 18th century equivalent of a trust fund kid. He's got wealth, status, political influence, beautiful plantations, every opportunity that British society can possibly offer a colonial aristocrat. His life should have been comfortable. His future should have been secure. Instead, he chose to put his name on the Declaration of Independence. And the funny part is that England itself may have created the revolutionary that they would later seize and imprison.
And we pick it up in just 60 seconds here on WMMB. So as we're considering Thomas Heyward Jr., Dave, law school in London, and he was not a fan of how the Brits were treating the colonists, and they created their own monster here?
In so many ways. Of course, he's a rich kid from South Carolina in the 1770s, and he gets sent to England to go to school, attends a school known as Middle Temple. It's in London, and it was one of the most prestigious law schools in Britain. I mean, it just, you know, you get that on your diploma, you're set for life. They taught him English law. They surrounded him with English culture. And when he came home, he would be more loyal than ever, right, to the English crown. That's what should have happened.
You might expect that, yeah.
But it didn't. Thomas Heyward experienced something that many of the colonial elites ended up experiencing firsthand. No matter how educated you were, no matter how wealthy you were, no matter how refined your manners were, if you came from America, English people, including the proletariats, looked at you like you were second class. You're not one of them. And that really rubbed Thomas Heyward Jr. raw. It's one thing to read about parliamentary taxes from Charleston. It's another thing entirely to be standing in London and realizing that the people that run the empire do not consider you to be equal. And that experience changed him. When he returned home to South Carolina, he wasn't just another successful attorney. He was a committed patriot. Now, signing the Declaration of Independence is not just an act of political theater. There was no press conference. It wasn't symbolic. What it was treason, high treason, punishable by death by hanging. And every man that signed that document knew what they were risking. And Thomas Heyward Jr. certainly knew that, and he signed it anyway. Now, here's where he's a little different from so many of the other founders who did sign that document. He didn't just stop with his signature. Many spent the rest of the war serving in legislatures or diplomacy or Congress or wherever. Heyward instead went out and joined the Army. He helps organize South Carolina's defenses. He becomes the commander of an artillery battalion. Now, artillery is not glamorous. If you see a lot of paintings, you don't see a lot of paintings of artillery. You see paintings of infantry and cavalry. Artillery is dirty, dangerous work, and it requires discipline, mathematics, engineering, logistics, and nerves of steel. You had to move these enormous guns over terrible roads, position them under enemy fire, calculate your range, and keep firing while everyone around you basically was trying to kill you. And you don't do that from behind a desk. Thomas Heyward was out there in the middle of it. And in 1779, during the Battle of Port Royal, he takes a hit. He gets wounded by a musket ball. He was actually wounded fighting for independence, for the Declaration of Independence that he had signed. Now, in the meantime, he was also doing some other things. So imagine this. You're commanding an artillery brigade, but you're also serving as a judge, a circuit court judge in South Carolina. Now, we've talked in the past about the battles in South Carolina. South Carolina is perhaps the most contested state in the entire American Revolution. There are more battles in South Carolina than anywhere else. And almost all of them, Bill, are Patriot against Loyalists. There's very few battles here that are actually British Army against Continental Army. This is a civil war in South Carolina. And neighbors are choosing sides. Families are splitting apart. People aren't just debating politics. They're killing each other over politics. You know, we've never been more divided, right?
Right.
Convicted loyalists would often be charged with crimes against the new South Carolina government. They would be tried and they would be convicted. And occasionally, they would be sentenced to death. And it was Thomas Heyward Jr., who, as a certain circuit judge, would oversee those executions. And he made a point of carrying out those executions in a particular style and in a particular place. He made certain that whenever they happened, the British troops could see them. It's not just justice, it's psychological warfare. We're serious. If you betray our cause, there will be consequences. It's a reminder that the American Revolution, it wasn't neat, it wasn't clean, and it certainly wasn't polite. The men we often picture in powdered wigs and velvet coats could be extraordinarily hard when they believed in survival. And they believed that their cause would demand it. Thomas Heyward certainly embodied that. He could argue legal points one day and command artillery the next and oversee the execution of a traitor on Wednesday. That's a resume. Now, here's what makes all of this remarkable. He didn't have to do any of this. Remember where we started. He was born into extraordinary privilege. Had he remained loyal to the crown, he almost certainly would have remained wealthy, respected, and comfortable. Instead, he gambled everything. What's the words? His life, his fortune, his property, his safety, even his life. Signing the Declaration, he would discover very shortly, it doesn't make you famous. Sometimes it leads to other problems. And this war, which has started in 1775 and continues to grind on as we pursue that Fabian strategy of George Washington, where we're just drawing this out and out and out, and it's going on and on and on, and it's becoming more and more intense and more personal and more divisive. Thomas Heyward, who has already been wounded, who has already served his country well, finds himself in the middle of one of the biggest battles of 1780 around Charleston, which we're going to lose. I'm going to, spoiler alert, we lose. And the British take a lot of prisoners. And among the prisoners they take is Thomas Heyward Jr., a traitor to the crown. The penalty, if he's convicted, could be death by hanging. But it's certainly going to be, at least for the time being a prisoner of the British Army.
Not the guy who wants to be in British custody.
Nope.
That's interesting. We dig into it more as Dave Does History continues in just moments here on Bill Mick Live on WMMB.
Our weekly dive into history. Dave Bowman joins us on Bill Mick Live.
O'Galley Electric bringing you the hour. Dave bringing you the history. And we're talking about Thomas Heyward Jr., South Carolina rich kid. Made it big and then decided being a British citizen is not all it's cracked up to be, and was a leader, big leader in the Revolution. Dave, we got to the battle around Charleston in 1780 where he got captured by the British. What happens to him at that point?
Well, this is an important, one of the things I've really avoided in Liberty 250 is going into the details of the battles. Charleston, you just need to understand, is one of the biggest defeats the Americans will suffer during the American Revolutionary War. And it's not just a defeat, it's an embarrassment, because the general that's leading it basically quits. It's a fiasco. And nearly 5,000 American soldiers are taken prisoner when Charleston surrenders in 1780. Amongst those, of course, is Thomas Heyward Jr., a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He is hauled off to Florida, St. Augustine, as a matter of fact. There's a fortress there called Fort St. Mark, and he is put in there as a prisoner of war until they decide what they want to do with him, which could be literally up to shipping him back to London and stringing him up from a gallows. But at this particular point, none of that has happened yet. Remember that in the overall context of things, despite the win at Charleston, the war is not going well for the British at all. The French are already in. Things are starting to, fall apart logistically. Cornwallis is having issues. The bottom line is we're less than a year out from the end of the war, really. I mean, it's going to end within a year. So they lock him up in there, and imagine this. You're a rich kid from South Carolina, and all of a sudden you're in a crappy British prison where, by the way, more Americans died in British prisons than on the actual battlefields. These prisons are atrocious. But even there, Heyward becomes something of a leader, and he becomes something of a penman. He gets some paper, Bill, and he writes a poem. And he writes this poem, and he sets it to the tune "God Save the King," the British national anthem. God save our gracious king, long may he live. He rewrites the words to "God Save Our 13 States." Now that's, okay, so what, right? July 4th, 1781, the anniversary of Independence Day, right?
Yes.
A ragged, unshaven Heyward and his fellow prisoners at Fort St. Mark in St. Augustine, Florida, get up. They stand on top of their bunks in their prison cell, and as loud as they possibly can, they sing this song to the British guards.
I bet that went over well.
Oh, they tell them to shut up. They tell them to be quiet. And you know what they do?
Sing louder.
Sing louder.
So we sing louder, and I guess that evokes the ire of the British, Dave.
The British don't really know what to do about this. And it's a great example of psychological moral warfare you'll ever find. Military historians, we talk about logistics and strategy and supply lines. All that stuff matters. But there's a fight that's also in the mind. And if you can convince your enemy that he's already lost, you've won half the battle. The British were never able to convince Thomas Heyward that he had lost. And in a way, he's convincing them that you're losing, not me. And I just can't even picture that moment. But imagine it. It would be amazing. After a year in captivity, the Battle of Yorktown happens. The war, for all practical purposes, is over, although it won't officially end for another 2 years. They decide that prisoners are going to be exchanged, and at this point, they can't really hang him because, we lost. So there you go. Freedom at last, right?
You would think.
Or so he thought. His adventure, however, not quite over. He's put on a ship that is sailing north back to South Carolina. And for reasons that are not entirely clear to me, he falls overboard. Think about that. He's survived artillery. He's survived being wounded. He survived in a British prison. And on the way home, you fall overboard. And if you know anything about this kind of stuff, you know that that's basically a death sentence. And yet, Thomas Heyward Jr. clings to the rudder, the pentles on the rudder. He actually manages to get his arm around one of the ropes that controls the rudder at the stern of the ship and hangs on for dear life. Now, if you think about this, you can't just stop the ship. This isn't like today. You got to lower all the sails, wait for the ship to slow down. Somebody has to go down there with a rope. He hangs on that long and manages to get up back on the ship. Now, if you wrote this as a fiction book, your editor would tell you, hey, nobody's going to believe that.
Make that scene more believable, Dave. Yeah.
Right. But he did. He makes it all the way home. And when he gets home, he finds out that the British have basically taken over everything. His plantation has been utterly destroyed. His buildings are damaged. His property has been stolen. Years of accumulated wealth has just evaporated. But there's the part of the story we have to approach with great honesty because it illustrates just how complicated things really were. The British confiscated 130 enslaved people from his plantation. From Heyward's perspective, this is a devastating financial loss. 18th century South Carolina, of course, slavery is a different thing. But from the perspective of those men and women, maybe things are a little bit different. They got their freedom, and thousands were offered that freedom by the British. They took it not because they loved King George, but because they wanted liberty for themselves.
Sure.
Which is what Thomas Heyward had promised when he signed a document that said, all men are created equal.
Mm-hmm.
It's a heartbreaking calculation if you happen to be a slave. Which side offers the best chance to be free? The British now, or the American promise that we believe these things, we're just not there yet? And sometimes different people are fighting for completely different definitions of freedom at the same time. Heyward believes passionately in American independence. I don't question that. He sacrificed his wealth, his comfort, his safety, and nearly his life for it. But his understanding of liberty had limits that were painfully obvious even to today. The unfinished promise that Heyward helped write in 1776, though, would be carried forward because eventually there would be a grandson that he would actually never meet. And that grandson would go on to fight for those same principles, that all men are created equal. And he would do so on the floor of the United States House of Representatives.
How cool is that? We get to that part of the story. We also let you talk to Dave at 321-768-1240 when Dave Does History continues in moments right here on WMMB.
They pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. We just bring the receipts. Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
O'Galley Electric brings you the hour, and in that tradition, our candidate interviews continue after the show today. I will have Larry Freeman and the incumbent Judge Robert Siegel in for those candidate interviews for the circuit judge number 4 seat. We'll look forward to having those on there. They'll be on the podcast section a little bit later today, top of the page at BillMick.com. Digging back into Thomas Heyward Jr., Dave, and risked everything, darn near lost everything. And you say he had a grandson who kind of carried on the tradition and picked up where Grandpa had left off long ago. Where are we going now?
Well, we're not quite there yet. He has a grandson, but there's some issues with that too. The important thing to keep in mind here is that for Thomas Heyward Jr., this whole idea is he believes in American independence. Now, today, we struggle with this, and you don't have to look far to find these people who will argue with you, well, we should ignore the Declaration of Independence because the people who wrote it were hypocrites. They all had slaves. They didn't all have slaves, but, people want to believe that.
It fits the narrative, so let it go. Yeah.
We split into two camps. They were hypocrites, so that ends the discussion. And the other side says, hey, don't judge them by modern standards. I don't think that either of those two answers is really sufficient. We deserve better than slogans, and history deserves better than slogans. Let's acknowledge what Thomas Heyward actually did. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He committed treason, risked execution, fought in battle, was wounded, a year in prison, and watched almost his entire fortune disappear because he refused to be a traitor to the American cause. None of that is imaginary. None of that should be diminished. But we should not pretend that slavery wasn't central to his life. The Heyward family wasn't just wealthy. Their wealth was enhanced by slavery. It depended on it. And by the end of the 18th century, as I said, 26,000 acres, hundreds of enslaved laborers. It's part of the story. Thomas Heyward believed sincerely that what he was fighting for liberty, and he was. The problem is his definition of liberty didn't necessarily yet include everyone. And that's one of the uncomfortable truths about our history. We often discover principles before we fully discover the implications. We knew E equals MC squared before we ever understood what it meant. Think about the Declaration itself. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Do you think Jefferson had any idea how far those words would reach? Benjamin Franklin, Adams, any of them. Thomas Heyward didn't either. They created an idea whose consequences they themselves could not control. And of course, it takes Abraham Lincoln and his apple of gold metaphor to portray this better than anyone. He would remind us that the Declaration was a standard for a free society, and he would argue that the founders knew that they could not immediately eliminate slavery, but they intentionally planted that principle so that future generations could. Now, whether you agree with Lincoln or not is irrelevant because history certainly unfolded that way. Every great reform movement in America eventually comes back to the Declaration. The abolitionists, the women's suffragists, the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King famously calling the Declaration of Independence a promissory note. This isn't an accident. These words prove stronger than the men who wrote them. Now, fast forward to this day in 1868. What happens? Today in 1868, we talked about it at the beginning of the show. The 14th Amendment is ratified, making people who were born here as slaves citizens in the fullest meaning of that word. Unfortunately, things began to change again in 1876. We had Jim Crow, we had violence, we had intimidation, we had election fraud, the KKK, the systematic effort to undo Reconstruction. And into that world steps a very young man by the name of Thomas Ezekiel Miller. Now, you probably have never heard of Thomas E. Miller, and if you haven't, you're not alone. Most Americans have not. And it's unfortunate because he was one of the most remarkable political figures in the 19th century. He's born in 1849. His father was a white member of Thomas Heyward's family, and his mother was a formerly enslaved black woman. That made Thomas Heyward Jr. his biological grandfather. Now just stop and think about that for just a moment. One generation signs the Declaration, the next generation inherits the fortune. A century later, their own descendants, who are half black, becomes one of the nation's leading civil rights advocates. Miller could have tried to disappear. he could have attempted to pass as white. And as I've shown Bill this morning, he could have. But he didn't try to do that. He openly identified with the black community. He attended Howard University, became a lawyer, entered politics, went to the legislature in South Carolina, and in 1890 was elected to the United States House of Representatives. Imagine walking into that chamber. On the walls hang the portraits of all the Revolutionary generation. Many of the men honored there had owned slaves. Now, standing on the House floor is the black grandson of one of those founders. If Hollywood wrote that script, people would accuse it of being woke, too symbolic, too whatever. But it's true. And Thomas Miller was not timid. He didn't go to Washington to make friends. He went to Washington to tell the truth. And one of his greatest speeches came as the southern states were systematically stripping black citizens of their constitutional rights. White politicians claim that there's no problem here. Miller stands on the House floor and says, let me tell you what's actually going on. He describes the violence. He describes the intimidation, the corruption. And he described ordinary Americans who had done nothing wrong, except they were black, being harassed and tortured and even killed. Miller told Congress about a black man who had been chained to a plow after being falsely accused of stealing a chicken. Not convicted, not given a trial, not given the rights as an American citizen, simply accused, chained to a plow like an animal. Black woman, hours after giving birth, dragged from her sickbed by a white constable. Why? Because she was black. And Miller asked his fellow congressman a simple question. Is this justice? Is this the Republican Party? Is this the republic that the founders, my grandfather, envisioned? These aren't comfortable questions, and they still aren't today. Thomas Miller was not rejecting the Declaration. He wasn't saying America had failed beyond redemption. He was saying exactly the opposite. He was saying, we're not living up to our own creed. We aren't living up to our own Declaration. We're not living up to our own Constitution. We're not living up to my grandfather's principles, even though he too did not live up to them. In other words, Thomas Heyward's own descendant used the founding against those who had abandoned its principles. Now, Reconstruction ultimately failed. Southern states erected barriers to voting, Jim Crow became entrenched, and Miller would lose his congressional seat after South Carolina rewrote its constitution to effectively disenfranchise black voters. It would take another 70 years before the civil rights movement finally would dismantle much of that system. But Miller had established something important. He demonstrated that the Declaration of Independence belonged to him every bit as much as it had belonged to Thomas Heyward. The promise isn't limited by race. It's not limited by wealth. It's not limited by ancestry. It belongs to every American. And that's why Heyward's story is so compelling. Some people today want us to choose, either celebrate the founders or condemn them. History rarely gives us choices that simple. Thomas Heyward deserves admiration for his extraordinary courage. He also deserves criticism for participating in one of history's greatest injustices. Both things can be true. In fact, if we're honest with ourselves, they are true. But here's what ultimately redeems the story. Thomas Heyward helped write the words that he himself was not able to fully live out. But those words escaped their author. They inspired Abraham Lincoln. They inspired Frederick Douglass. They inspired Susan B. Anthony. They inspired Martin Luther King Jr. And before any of them, they inspired Thomas Ezekiel Miller, Thomas Heyward's grandson. That may be the greatest irony in American history. The grandfather signed the promise. The grandson demanded that the nation keep it, not by abandoning the Declaration, but by insisting that we finally believe it.
Dave, as we wrap this up, by the way, 321-768-1240 if you want in with Dave. The generational aspect of this is the cool part of this story for me. Grandfather was involved. Grandson gets himself elected to Congress and starts fighting for those very things that Grandpa maybe didn't promise him in person. Promised him in general with signing the document, but lo and behold, he's still having to fight for it many, many years later, something we continue to fight for today.
And we always will. And that's the part that the people that would have it just reject it, to me, they don't seem to understand, is that you never achieve perfection. And in fact, even in the Constitution, it doesn't say we're done. It says to create a more perfect union. In other words, to continue to move forward and leaving those things open-ended. The Declaration of Independence has become criticized, mocked, ignored, and yet even amongst conservatives today, Bill, how many of us run to, well, the Constitution, the values of the Constitution, and it's like we forget the Declaration is the principle.
Yeah, it's the foundation.
And we just sort of forget it, and that has come to really bother me. This idea of carrying forward your family's work, of course, that appeals to me greatly. This idea that Thomas Miller could have just disappeared. He could have pretended to be white. He could have possibly inherited his family's fortune and moved on. But he chose instead to work for that promise is just amazing to me. And it's something that raises that question in my own mind. Am I doing enough to carry on the legacy of those who were there in my own family?
And I think you're doing something equally as important, is that you put together Dave Does History. You put together everything we've talked about for well over the last year. And you're not doing it just for us in this audience. You're doing it for your son, your family, and generations beyond to give them an understanding of what we need to appreciate here. And hopefully that's exactly what it's doing.
I certainly hope so. 250 years from now, I hope they're still talking about it.
Check out more stories from history at davedoeshistory.org.